All right, awesome. So you'll have to forgive me. This is going to be mostly an informal presentation in terms of the interaction, as well as like I want to make sure that it's an open environment where people feel free to interrupt me, ask questions. If I feel that the questions are kind of going a little bit too far away during the presentation itself, where I still have a few more slides to go through, I will just ask that we hold the majority of questions until the end, but don't worry about asking a few questions. And I'm more than enough of an adult to, stem me the flood if I need to. The presentation itself, I frame in these nice marketing terms as product managing your life, thriving in chaos and uncertainty. Fairly topical given the year that we've been having as a species on this planet around the world. And the idea around thrive is not this idea of like succeeding and being successful like in like a top of class kind of way. It's more understanding in terms of how to get to a goal, how to meet a goal, regardless or despite the circumstances that you might be presented with. And the inspiration for this presentation really resulted from a series of life experiences that I had that ultimately made me realize that I had been applying these ideas of product principles and problem solving really throughout different stages of my life. As you can see here, my name is Erwin. Last name is Kim. It's November 2020. These are all things that you're aware of. Moving on, this is the agenda. There's going to be an introduction to framing, a few introductory slides. I'm going to go through a kind of alignment on vernacular and syntax and what we mean when we say certain words. So what is a product manager? For those who haven't worked in Silicon Valley or for startups from the Bay Area, this is going to be a critical point of discussion for me or clarification, as the term product manager has nuances and variances as the term has become more popularized and the role has become more formalized across both geographic as well as market contexts. What does a product manager do? That's going to be more of a generalized thing because as anyone who's worked in product knows, then the answer is really more it depends. Processes to my life here is going to be the kind of the main crux of it. And I'm going to speak about one specific instance of that. The summary is just going to be a list of things that I'm not going to go through too much in detail. But what I would say is I would recommend that you follow the information that I provide there after you receive the presentation itself. So, and some resources, not exhaustive, and then a Q&A, which I hope that y'all will engage with. And I'm going to try to give at least 25 minutes to 20 minutes for. What is this presentation? What is the overview of this presentation? What do I want you to take away? This presentation is really like a semi-autobiographical or autobiographical account of one instance in my life after undergrad in which I was faced with a series of problems that I think a lot of people are facing different stages in their life, not just in undergrad, and aren't necessarily easy to solve, especially if the resources that you have access to aren't necessarily, a multi-million-dollar billionaire father that has a real estate empire in New York. I don't know if I'm talking about there, but I think that y'all can guess. What this presentation is not is a prescriptive set of guidelines, rules, and like that Medium article list of like, you won't believe these 10 steps that will give you success. Now, I don't do that. All that is like smoke and mirrors and like the modern millennial version of a multi-level marketing scheme. In other words, it's a lot of steaming bullshit. So what I'm presenting is a tactical approach that I have found that worked for myself, grounded in an applicable scenario that is hopefully generalized enough that you can take something away there alongside the summary and resources to aid yourself if you want to or not, or maybe you don't need help, because the intention here is not to say that there's anything wrong with anyone. It's just more how I have approached challenging circumstances. Yeah, let's get it done. So next slide. So who am I? This is a photo that my colleague took of me when I used to work for a manufacturing analytics startup. It was actually the first startup I worked for in a product manager capacity in San Francisco. My hair was obviously a lot longer there, and I had a tendency to smile more. I don't smile that much anymore. That's more of a personal decision, not really impacted by the world. And what have I done? So I was pre-med, did 4.5 years of clinical research, blah, blah, blah. Medical school is expensive. And I got into technology and customer support because I didn't know what startups were like, but I wanted to go into do things with computers and stuff because I like that stuff, but I didn't really know what that meant as an industry, profession, market, etc. Since that period of time, I have worked in healthcare consulting, healthcare tech, manufacturing, fulfillment, reverse logistics, and the 3PL, integration, legacy systems, like all the different kind of fancy terms there. Basically, all the things that go on behind the scenes when you return something or order something from a Amazon-esque entity, but like less technically savvy because Amazon doesn't have 3 different legacy systems that I need to fix within 3 months, which is what I had to do. Analytics, general management, ad hoc management, peer mentorship, et cetera, consulting, in education enablement, both in a pro bono as well as a give me money perspective, and then financial, so cash flow analyses, discounted cash flow analyses, forecasting, blah, 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 all the fancy words that I luckily didn't have to go to MBA school to learn, which ultimately was great for my cash flow. So that's me. I'm not saying I am anyone that has the credibility to be listened to, but I hope that throughout my short career so far, it's about 7 years since I graduated from university, I can at least provide a set of recommendations that have allowed me to succeed in a variety of different markets, industries, and areas despite my relative lack of tenure. So why did I want to give this talk? Doing a call back to my earlier point on this presentation, 2020 has been a lot. And that is a fair understatement. It's been really shitty for a lot of people. And this is kind of how a lot of us feel. It's, you know, like everything's burning around us, but we're kind of in a situation where we have to deal with the fact that we're like, yeah, this is fine. It's really not, and that's okay. And, you know, sometimes you just want to flip things over. I get it. It's a feeling that I feel sometimes and frequently, and it's okay. So one of the things and one of the reasons why I want to lead with these 2 things before I get into the meat and potatoes of this part here is that when I talk about product managing your life, I'm not talking about being like an uber rational, uber mensch kind of robot person. It means understanding the constraints, context, and the environment in which you're operating. And as humans are emotional beings, emotions, including mental health, physical health, these things all factor in and should not be ignored or downplayed. So what is a product manager? A product manager is a term that is difficult to explain. And generally, I just tell my mother that I am a product janitor. I've talked to a lot of people. I've learned how to say no in a variety of different contexts. I've learned a lot of fancy initialisms and acronyms that ultimately don't mean that much, but make me sound impressive. So in a more or less sarcastic way, the product manager can be framed in a Bay Area context or a Silicon Valley context, where the term really kind of was born, and how I define it as an individual who has to have a wide subset of skills that really generally fall into how do you think about business and how do you explain it and measure it? Are you detail oriented just to the point where you can have and drive conversations to achieve business goals, customer goals, etc.? Do you understand what it means to have a notice or opportunity as well as action that? As well as being able to communicate to a wide variety of audiences. If you're a product manager at a company like a Facebook or a Google, despite how kind of evilly they are now, you have to be expected to operate in a way that you are linguistically flexible enough to talk to engineers, system admins, C-levels, potentially depending on your role in the product, mathematicians, if it's one, physicists, if it's in a domain of AI or like high-end computing areas, designers of all sorts, design researchers, UI designers, UX designers, like hardware designers, industrial designers, etc., and be able to communicate effectively and efficiently across these different audience types, especially when they're all together. You need to be able to be ambidextrous, which just basically just means like, can you do a lot of different things in a flexible way or fleet-footed? And then intensely curious. Product management is a role that, because it lacks a lot of rigor around the hard skills, unless you're working on like a MongoDB, a Redshift, Snowflake, etc., your expectation is really to be able to like understand what's going on. What are the trends that are changing things? What are the opportunities that can emerge from the development of this new chip or whatever? Like, what are the changing interaction paradigms that customers, businesses, enterprises, countries even are engaging in now, but that there aren't great solutions for right now? What are kids doing? How's the market going to shift as millennials take over the majority of market share as Gen Z does, etc. And then resolute. Candidly, I've been in role like as a product manager. I've had situations where I've had to sit there for an hour while the CEO of a startup yells at me. And I just sat there and I was like, thank you for the feedback. That was appreciated. I understand where you're coming from now. And honestly, I did, because if you're doing your job well, things will work. If you're doing your job great, people may not know what you're necessarily doing. But really, it's also that if things go wrong, you have to own the failure. It doesn't matter that you didn't write the code. It doesn't matter that you didn't design the app. It doesn't matter that you were responsible for the deployment. I'm not responsible for that, because ultimately, as a leader, it's your fault. And you have to own that from an accountability perspective. And very similarly to life, that's kind of how life functions. Like at the end of the day, you have to be an owner and accountable to the things that are within your domain, or understand what is within your control. So what does a product manager do? This is a big question where the answers will vary depending on the person you talk to. I try to make this as generalizable as possible. And really it breaks down into problem decomposition. What does that mean? What is a problem? Why does it matter? That's kind of the first line there. Who is the problem a problem for? So who are the customers? Your primary, your secondary, your tertiary? Are there network effects that you need to take into consideration? Are there complementary economic effects that you have to take into consideration? Are your customers frenemies? Were there customer frenemies if you're in a partnership with a company that could compete against you at some point? What are the solutions that would potentially work for the problem if you identify it as a problem and set of customers that are viable from a business perspective? Because at the end of the day, if it's not making money, or if it doesn't complement the effort to make money, then it's a nice intellectual exercise that has no bearing in reality, unfortunately. What are the solutions? So like, how do you brainstorm those things? Like, what do they mean? Are you able to do that in a creative, intellectual, or not intellectual, that's actually too fancy and I hate that word. In a creative way, like, are you constraining yourself? Like, if you are thinking about VR, like, should you immediately dismiss VR because the constraint technically or feasibly seems to be insurmountable? As a product manager, you may not know that, so just throw it up there. And then that's where you're going to prioritize, build, and test. So arrive at a framework, and you'll hear this term a lot from both myself as well as any other product folks. I don't know who is a product manager on this call, where frameworks are things that allow you to apply a certain degree of structure to chaos. That's all that means. It doesn't mean that the chaos goes away. It just means that your perspective shifts in a way that you are able to ignore a lot of the chaos and focus in on the elements of that chaos that relate to the goal that you're trying to achieve and the problem that you're trying to solve. And then those frameworks lend you the ability to then prioritize and define a set of experimental criteria to build some proof of concepts against, to validate some initial hypotheses or assumptions in the market and figure out if it worked. A good example of that is when DoorDash started. DoorDash was started by the three founders when they were three, I think. Yeah, I think so. At Stanford, when they were just like, all right, let's see if this works. They threw up a landing page that was basically just static web pages of menus, set up a phone number on there that just called to one of their cell phones and made the first initial set of deliveries themselves. And they're like, it seems like there's a market for this. And they didn't stop there. They kept testing these hypotheses. They did these things manually. They, like a common idiom within the area is like they, dog fooded their product. They ate their own dog food, which is like understanding, does this work? Is there a market viability? People pay for this. And what they didn't do was focus on the delivery aspect purely, but they focused on the scalable platform play that resulted in an operational efficiency at scale that enabled the delivery and the restaurants and all the kind of the orchestration that's necessary for DoorDash to be successful nationally, and is now worth several $billion. And then once you arrive at a set of requirements, these are traditional things called MVP. MVP is kind of going away now because people have, similar to Agile, taken the word, stabbed it to death, and then represented it to people and be like, this still has value. And it's like, no, it's dead now. It just basically means what is a minimum set of requirements that you can launch with that allows you to achieve your initial success metrics, or at least measure against them, and then define an iterative growth plan to make the product better, or maybe decide what that the product needs to go back on the shelf. or deprecated. So a lot of words there. This is why you're here. Maybe, I don't know. Define, like when you think about the core competencies of product manager, the core like process of product management, what does that really mean? All it means is that you are able to solve or decompose problems in a prioritized fashion with an understanding of the context in which those problems live. And that's why earlier I said, don't ignore the emotional context, because that matters. If you ignore the emotional context, that's like doing a math problem and just omitting a total set of variables, because you're like, I'm just going to ignore that part. No, that's why companies fail. That's why those startups who are like, oh, I don't know why this product that we just launched flop. It's because your company is made up of a non-diverse like pool of people who literally don't understand all the problems that they're supposed to be trying to solve for. Like that's why those companies fail, and why diversity not only matters from like a economic perspective, not only from an ethical perspective, from an economic perspective. It's point of views that you don't have because you only have your lived experience, and that kind of goes into the understand yourself. So lots of people, especially with the mindfulness movement and all these apps, like to performatively talk about the fact that they understand themselves and are introspective and blah, 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 all these multi-syllable words that they might have learned from a Medium article or from their psychiatrist. What it really means is like, do you know what you don't know? And are you comfortable with that or not? It's okay to be uncomfortable with it too. And do you understand like your operating paradigms, your context? Like if you set up a project for yourself, do you always find yourself consistently failing? Like that might not be a problem with like the project or necessarily yourself, but how you're structuring that project, because the goal is too big. So understanding how you work, how you operate, when your days are bad, do you know when those days are bad, when you're productive? It's just understanding who you are and what you're not and what you don't know. Brainstorming solutions. So like if you understand like to a certain degree who you are and who you're not, and you've identified those problems, it goes into, well, what can I do to solve those things? Prioritize and time box. So what I mean by time boxing is that we get into these situations generally, and this is from like a behavioral psychology perspective as well. And luckily I'm in an armchair already, so I'm going to be an armchair psychologist. It basically just means that goals that are not time bound are not goals, because you need to have that time bound as a constraint. Startups, a lot of them fail, but some of them become these multi-billion-dollar unicorns because they operate within a set of constraints that force them to prioritize, to utilize their energy and outputs in the most effective manner, hopefully, or they fail. But it's a constraint that you need to apply there, because you can't just spin your wheels forever being like, today I am going to ride my bike. Okay, so today's been 10 years now. Now what are you going to do? The last thing is start, measure, iterate. It just means, the hardest step is always the first. That's that idiom that people love to say, but it's true for a reason, because if you don't do anything, then all the preparatory work doesn't matter. If you don't take that first step, it doesn't matter. If you don't take that risk, it doesn't matter, because hypotheticals are just that. They're hypotheticals that are, again, an interesting mental exercise that really have no bearing in reality and are functionally useless for you and the problems you're trying to address. Sorry, not super happy, but like I just like am trying to frame it in the way that I think about it, and I'm also not saying this is the best way to do it. So that is the poop emoji in 3D form. How I apply product principles to key stages. I capitalize product for reasons, I guess. So as an undergrad at the University of Michigan, hallowed be thy name with its public health crisis right now. I need to understand what my problem was. As an undergrad, when I graduated, I was at a risk around my career. I categorized my problems, by the way, you'll notice here. I was uncertain about what to do after medical school plans fell through. Medical school is too expensive. I sure couldn't afford it. I didn't have any financial safety net or social safety nets to aid me in that endeavor. I'm the only person in my family who was born, grew up, and still lives here. And that was true then, and it is true now. I didn't have people who could give me money for rent. I worked all through undergrad. I didn't have, basically, if I had failed at that point, I would have just been homeless. And it's not like it's not a bad thing. It just is a thing. Health-wise, like I had poor mental health. I was dealing with I'm mildly on the spectrum. I have like severe clinical depression, multiple points of like being suicidal throughout my life. That doesn't really just go away. Severe social anxiety as well as general anxiety. Um, what else? Oh, there's a list of things that have like these alphanumeric strings associated with them that are in like the disease thing. But basically, my brain, in terms of psychological health, not great. And then other health category, I didn't have medical insurance. I didn't have medical insurance until I was 24, which is kind of a foreshadowing bit here. So here are my problems. These are all big problems. Like they fit into these categories of career, safety, health. And at this point, I can't necessarily solve these problems because I haven't, like, I understand what they broadly are, but how do we solve like a career thing? Like there are people who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and it's okay, who don't know what their career is going to be and or have shifted their careers a lot. That's a big, unbounded, and kind of ambiguous problem, right? So what did I do? I did some further decomposition of who am I? Like, what does that mean? Do I like what do I do all the time? The things that were really tough for me to reconcile with, like the things that are not fun to hear from another person, I had to force myself to hear from others, put myself in front of others, like went through basically the cognitive behavioral therapy kind of cycle of like all these different things that I've been doing, all these different actions and behaviors that I've been taking, and whether or not that helped me at all. Like I try to apply some binary analysis. Like, did this help or did this hurt? And hurt could just include just like maybe it didn't do anything. But if it didn't help, then it's a question of why am I doing them? So basically the categorization here is like a loose framing of like a persona, if you've ever heard that term, or just a generalization of like wants, needs, and constraints. So I wanted to figure out what I wanted to do. So career. I needed to build social and financial safety nets to de-risk failure scenarios. Homelessness. Needed to address mental health challenges to enable success. Generally, I wanted to be able to be happy, figure out what that meant, have valuable and fulfilling relationships with other human beings, be able to be a colleague that people liked, a friend that people relied on, that could also rely on those friends, all those sorts of things, all those nice things. I needed a job for insurance and stability. If I at that point had any sort of issue, I would probably have died, which would have sucked. But like I said, wouldn't have cared if that had happened to me because I'd be dead. And another constraint, no savings. So I wouldn't like, I didn't like, again, homeless. Yeah, constraint, no place to live, homeless. And I didn't have anywhere I could be necessarily. So let's go on. So I understand myself a little bit. I understand my problems. What can I do about this? And this is what I mean by like, don't bound yourself purely by like what seems feasible, because when you constrain yourself initially, what that means is that you're necessarily restricting your creativity. It doesn't matter if it's feasible right now. You don't even know what that means necessarily, right? So it's like, I could find a part-time job, but that doesn't solve my problems around like insurance or other things. But let's just keep going. I could go to graduate school. I could go back home. I actually couldn't. I just listed that. Again, feasibility versus just getting those creative juices going, writing down every single possible solution. I could live with friends. Nope. Find a full-time job. Get a therapist. Nope. I don't know how you do that without money and insurance. Create a financial safety net. Can't do that with a job. Find a full-time job. Yeah. Find a place to live. Can't do that with a job. Find a patron. Don't really want to explore what that meant. Do something illegal for money. Similar scenario. Give up. Definitely a valid option, not one that I decided to take. So did a little bit of brainstorming, kind of created this list. Not a lot of great options, but some that could work. What happened next? So the next was prioritizing time blocks. So yes, there were things where like I wanted to figure out my career, I wanted to get a therapist, I wanted to create a financial safety net. Like I didn't want to give up, but like let's just forget the fact that it's there. So this is what I mean by time blocks. I can't reasonably do everything at once. I don't have the mental energy for it. I would have just been depressed. I would have set myself up for failure. What are things that I can do? I can find a full-time job, which will allow me to find a place to live. From that, I can then achieve a certain degree of stability within a certain period of time, and I time box this to 3 months. I forced myself to find a full-time job within the period of summer in which I was subleasing after my senior year of university, a job before August. And I did. It sucked. It wasn't easy, but I had time boxed it, and I had figured out if I don't get a full-time job, what are my other options? What are things that I can do? Like they weren't great secondary, tertiary, or like quaternary, no, whatever, like fourth degree options, but they were options. Join the military and enlist, be a non-com, like do this other thing, like none of these are great options, but they presented paths forward that unlocked additional opportunities for me within the constraints I had to operate in. Assuming that all other variables stayed the same, but you can't always, like, if you are worried about things going wrong, you're not going to do anything then, right? And there's a certain point at which, or an upper limit at which, planning kind of falls short. Like there's the military adage that like the best plans don't stand up to first contact. Really, the other thing is just like the best plans don't stand up to reality. You need to build in flexibility to your plans, and which will inherently build in flexibility to yourself because life goes all sorts of ways. This year is a really amazing and awful example of that. And what happened? Start, measure, iterate. After solving those two problems for myself, first step, like getting a job, finding a place to live. I found a job several. I have worked at 8 different companies where I had the fortunate like position to prioritize my time. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was that you can always make more money, you can never make more time. So I took that to heart and de-risked that as much as I could so I wasn't homeless, but in a way that allowed me to prioritize and figure out the other things that mattered to me. And this is all oriented, like I had these North Stars I started to develop. I finally got healthcare when I turned 24. Woo. I started building and continuing to build financial safety. So I learned about I was self-learning around investments, like investing portfolios, ETF versus not, like I got into a little crypto thing, blah, blah, blah. Basically what it means is because I had a certain degree of stability by having a roof over my head, like a stable supply of food and a job, I started doing other things. I found a therapist, a psychiatrist. That was one of the best things that ever happened to me. I've been going to therapy for the last 7 years, or not 7 years, 5 years, 6 years. Basically, I've been going a lot, and it's been awesome. I recommend it to everybody. I acquired mentors because I realized that I didn't have the network of people in my life that I could be like, hey, dad, hey, mom, what do I do in this situation? No. So I had to solve that because, yes, I didn't have an issue with trying things out and failing repeatedly. But again, a time point, right? So like one of my principles was also like, I need to utilize my time effectively. People have done this before. People have done product stuff before or job stuff or whatever. So I asked people around me if they wanted to be my mentor. I got better at asking that question instead of just kind of like ham-fisting it initially. And I created a group of mentors that have really helped to shape who I am today and have continued to be the friends and mentors that are like, Erwin, you kind of suck right now and you should stop being like that. I'm like, okay, cool. Thank you for telling me that. And I mean it because they function as the type of support that you need in that context, professionally as well as emotionally, socially, et cetera. I highly recommend getting a mentor. You can ignore that advice, but every single piece of like the reason why I did this is like I read all those books by all these famous Americans and international people who are like, I'm a billionaire, and like they always talk about the mentors. Every single one. There's not a single one who has been successful that has not had critical mentorship in their life. I define long-term career goals. I know what I want to do to a certain extent, which is, a weird thing to say because it's not as definitive as it sounds. And I continue to test out ways to improve. I constantly seek out feedback from people. I ask people to call me out when I do things that aren't okay. And I basically force myself to embrace the suck because having people tell you how you suck is not fun, but it is necessary. Because if you never listen to that, then you're just gonna, like, for me, my perspective, always top out. Like, growth comes from challenge and risk and embracing the suck. You don't suddenly be able to like run a marathon by ignoring running every morning and then trying to run a marathon. You embrace the suck, wake up at 6 a.m. on a running program, and go do it. That being said, context matters a lot. I'm not saying that everyone can do this. So figuring out what that means for you, improving and figuring out what that means for you is really important as well. Summary, there's a lot of words. Basically goals, time, don't ignore the emotions. Yeah, and honestly figure out what works for you, measure it. Like I tried out a variety of different techniques, bullet journaling, task management. journal, like all these sorts of things that helped me start to get a sense of like what mattered to me and what that meant. Constantly like decomposing words, not just from a definition perspective, but from an emotional context. And that's all really helped me. And I had talked for like half an hour now and my mouth hurts. So here's some references. Hooked is a good one about design and product. Thank you, Eileen. Indistractable is a good one. Well-Designed Life is a great one. Nonviolent Communication is probably the most impactful book I've ever read in my life, both my professional and personal life. I highly recommend that. If you take anything away from this presentation, get that book. For context, for those who are unfamiliar, it was a book that was written by Rosenberg with the aspirational goals again, of providing a set of negotiation techniques in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Definitely a moonshot there, but he wanted people to understand both the emotional as well as the objective context in which they're operating and having conversations. And I think that's super important. The other book I'd recommend is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's just a great insight into why you can't ignore the emotions, why we make decisions that are not rational, why we do things that seemingly are asynchronous with the fact that in all other contexts, we do things in a rational way. Podcast, Code Switch, Hidden Brain, Terrible Thanks for Asking, 99% Invisible. I've primarily gravitated towards saying that helped me get a perspective into the lived experiences of people that are not me, which is everyone else. Like, I don't know what it's like to grow up in New York City. I don't know what it's like to grow up in Europe. I don't know what it's like to be a woman. I don't know what it's like to be a person of color that's not Asian American or Korean American. So like exposure to those things not only gives me appreciation for the diversity of experience, but candidly, it gives me the ability to apply lateral and horizontal thinking methodologies to problem solving. I might learn something from a podcast about how a community in Flint came together and called out the government and the agencies being like, you're poisoning our kids, which is what the doctor who was in charge of, or at one of the hospitals did. And I really feel bad because I can't remember her name. I'm sure Janelle might know. And those are the types of things that you learn from other lived experiences, because when you learn about the solutions that people come to based off of the constraints that they're operating that you may never be exposed to, you find opportunities where you can carry over the generalized principles and apply them to your own life. Not always, but at the same time, it's just always interesting to learn about other people's lives. Terrible Things for Asking, I highly recommend. It's not a great listen in terms of, it's not happy, but it's real. And it's started by Norm Ernie as a podcast for helping her deal with the grief of losing her husband and son, I believe. And I like it because we're constantly in this barrage of false positivity of like, oh, you should smile. Like, did you check out the Calm app? Like, oh, I love Headspace. Like, I meditate every day. I don't, honestly and candidly, I don't give a straight. I'm not cursed, but like, whatever. Like, life isn't always that rosy. And I think recognizing that gives a certain degree of catharsis for people who want that recognition, who don't want, oh man, like, I feel like something's wrong with me because I followed these 10 steps in this Medium article and I'm not happy. So highly recommend that. Code Switch is really great around those different experiences. Hidden Brain is a behavioral psychology one. So I'll look into that. It's very, very relevant in the context of technology as well as general business operations. And on that note, Q&A.